This is our third session, and today we'll be talking about the Christian worldview. The series is entitled Making Sense of the World, and what we think is important is to be able to understand the world around us so that we can serve Christ, so that we can understand the world for ourselves, and we can begin to live in a way that really honors our Lord. In the first session, we talked about why even study worldviews? Well, that I think helps a lot because we realize that every person has a worldview, and there's 8 billion people in the world. That means there's 8 billion worldviews. But what worldviews actually allow us to do is to put them in basic categories so that we can understand fundamentally what each person believes. And once we do that, then we can begin to interact with them in a meaningful way. And then in our second session, we talked about these major categories: naturalism, which is the belief that there is no God; transcendentalism, the belief that everything is God; and then theism is the belief that there is a God who created the heavens and the earth, and that there are three major religions which hold to theism, and they are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, looking at those three theistic religions and pointing out the differences so that we can understand how all of that comes together. So let's dive in if we can. Story 3, worldview 3, is that the ultimate reality of all things is God, the God who created the heavens and the earth. The three expressions that we talked about were Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And those are important because these are the three major religions in the world today, particularly those who say that they believe in a personal God. And if we look at them historically, we have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Judaism being begun at about 2000 BC, Christianity coming at the beginning of what we call the modern era, back in AD 30. And then 600 years after Christ, Islam came into being through the leadership of what we call Muhammad. Let's look at Judaism and Islam to get an understanding somewhat of what these other religions say about God. First of all, Judaism. Judaism, of course, are those who believe in God, those of all who follow God, and those who use what we would call the Old Testament as their scriptures. In fact, they really look at the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They call that the Torah, and that is the foundation for the beliefs of what it means to be a Jew. Jewish people believe there's only one God who has established a covenant or a special agreement with them. God communicates to believers through prophets and rewards good deeds while punishing evil deeds. Most Jews, with the exception of a few groups, believe that their Messiah has not yet come, but one day will come. And I think it's important, too, to recognize that many of the Jews do not believe in an afterlife, because it's not explicitly stated in the Old Testament. And their focus is, if I asked a Jew, and I asked a Jewish rabbi, I said, do you believe in life after death? And he said, well, we don't know for sure. It's not explicitly stated in the first 5 books, and it's only hinted at. We believe that what God wants to do is to bring about the kingdom of God on the earth and to use Jews, God's chosen people, to do that. But as far as what happens after that, we don't know. A lot of Jews do believe that when they die, they are resurrected and are with God in heaven, but many do not. And so they will say that they just do not know. Could you go on to the next slide, please? Islam, on the other hand, is a belief that came about, as I mentioned, 600 years after Christ. The word Islam means submission, and those who follow Islam are called Muslims, which means one who submits. So how does Islam differ? What are the basic points of Islam to remember? Well, first is their belief in the oneness of God. Muslims believe that God is one and that God is the creator of all things, that God is all-powerful and all-knowing. They say God has no offspring, no race, no gender, no body, and is unaffected by the characteristics of human life. Many of you are probably familiar with how Muslims live out their life. If you've ever been to a Muslim country, you've probably heard the call to prayer early in the morning, late at night, and then 3 other times during the day, where Muslims are supposed to stop and pray. Other times you realize that there are some very, very important beliefs. And the most fundamental belief is what's called the Declaration of Faith in Islam. And it's something, it's also the first pillar that we'll talk about, the first pillar of Islam. And it's basically this: there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet, is his messenger. Now, you see, that is the first pillar. There are 5 pillars that every person who is a Muslim must follow. If they follow these 5 pillars, then they will be acceptable to God, and hopefully have a life after death. Notice the first pillar is the declaration of faith. And then the obligatory prayers that I mentioned, those are the prayers that you pray 5 times a day, the call of prayer. And then there's compulsory giving. They must always give to the poor. This is something that Allah requires them to do, and they must do so generously. And then during the month of Ramadan, they fast during the daytime. This is something that usually happens in the spring, but sometimes because they use a lunar calendar, it kind of moves through the year. And the idea is that you are fasting in repentance and fasting to get closer to Allah. And then at night you can eat as much as you want, as long as the sun is down. And then the next day you start and you don't eat during the daytime. And the final pillar is the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every Muslim is desiring to, one way or another, to go to Mecca, to be there, because this is a very holy site to Islam. Now, once they've done all of this, then the rest of their lives will be measured by whether they do good deeds or bad deeds. And there are actual scales in heaven, they describe, that if you do good deeds and they outweigh your bad deeds, and you've fulfilled all the 5 pillars, then it is very possible that you can go to paradise where Allah is. It's interesting that they'll never say that you will definitely go, because the last decision, of course, is up to Allah himself. I think it's important for us to realize that, unlike Christianity, Islam and Judaism emphasize the quality and the quantity of the good deeds of our lives, that these deeds determine our reward or punishment in the world to come. And in fact, every worldview, every religion, in one way or another, is this kind of karma, that the deeds that you do will be measured good or bad. And if you have an overabundance of good deeds, it's very possible that you will indeed be rewarded. Now let's turn our attention for the last few minutes to the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview, of course, is founded by the person of Jesus Christ. And in many ways, it's a continuation of the Old Testament. It's a fulfillment of the Old Testament. And therefore, there is a unique relationship between the Jews and the Christians. In fact, in the New Testament, there are many statements that refer to the Jews as being, one way or another, the precursors of what God is doing, and that one day all Israel will be saved, and we pray for that. But here's a sentence summarizing what Christianity actually is, the Christian worldview is. Humanity and the universe are created by and supervised by God, who has revealed himself to humanity through his word. And the word is seen in two different ways: the incarnate word, that is Jesus Christ, and the written word, the scriptures. Jesus is referred to as the word. In fact, if you remember from John chapter 1, in the beginning was the word. And then later on in verse 14, I think it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And so Jesus is called the Word because he is speaking about God. He is his very embodiment, his very life is telling us so much about God. In fact, I always say that if you want to know what God is like, all you have to do is to look to the person of Jesus Christ. What did he say? How did he live? What was important to him? In fact, he also said in the upper room, if you remember, when one of the disciples said, Lord, just show us the Father and we will believe. And Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And the unique reality of the God being Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is something that is uniquely Christian. And then, of course, the written word. God has revealed himself also in words so that we can have them before us. Not only in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, in the story. God inspired those writers, and God guided their hand as they wrote about the history of the ministry of Jesus Christ in Matthew and in Mark and in Luke and in John. And then the incredible history of the early church through the Acts of the Apostles. And then the letters that God used his disciples to write, to give instructions to believers, which we follow today, as we live our lives for Jesus Christ. And that last incredibly difficult book to understand, the book of Revelation, the Apocalypse, of what God has in store for the future. The reality is, of course, that we are people of the book. Remember, as we think through what God is doing and how we are supposed to be living this out for him. We talked last time about the 4 chapters of the Christian worldview: creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. This is not only the outline of what the Christian worldview is, but this is the outline and the progression of the Bible too, isn't it? In the beginning, God created, and the creation of the world is seen. The creation of humanity becomes a reality, and humanity is in face-to-face, intimate relationship with God. And when the Bible closes, humanity is in face-to-face, intimate relationship with God. So when we look at our Bibles, we've got the whole story right there. But in between are 2 chapters, the chapter of the fall, which immediately in Genesis chapter 3, humanity sins against God, rebels against God, turning their attention to themselves and away from God, and away from what God had told them that they needed to do. And that fall, that one sin has ever since affected and infected humanity. We are now sinful. We inherited it, and then we practice it every single day. And God had said in those chapters, early chapters of Genesis, that if they did what he told them not to do, that at that moment they would start to die. They would start to die. That brought death into the world. And so the only way to pay for the penalty of that rebellion, of course, was them to die. And people have been dying ever since. But what God is doing is he's getting his family back by coming himself to die for us in our place, so that the penalty is gone. There is no way that we can develop enough karma to overcome the sinfulness that each of us has. And what God is doing, he's breaking that cycle of trying to work our way back to God by sending Jesus Christ to die for us, and then through his work for us, we are forgiven, and now we live for God, and we await the restoration. So the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration of the Christ-centered worldview is not only a good map of understanding of what goes on in the world, but also gives us incredible hope for the future as well. What I'd like to do now is to give you some important truths about the Christian worldview. And all of these, except for the first one, are different than what you will find in Judaism and Islam, because it's important when we say, that the Jews believe in God and the Muslims believe in God and the Christians believe in God, and they're all the same. Well, not true, not true. Christians, we are Christ-centered, and He is the focus of it all. And so here are some basic truths about Christianity that are important for us to be able to know and to understand. Now, of course, the first is that God created the universe. Both Islam and Judaism believe in that as well, and as do Christians. But secondly, God created humanity in His image, in His likeness. That is, God created us with the intellectual and spiritual capacity to not only relate with each other, but to have a relationship with God, to be able to communicate to God, so God can communicate to us both intellectually and spiritually. Thirdly, as I just referred to this, is that humanity rebelled against God, and we now exist in a state of sin. We do not have to prove that sin is in the world or that people are sinful. That comes out every single day in our lives. And even children. Children are selfish because they're small, but as we get older, we don't lose our selfishness. We actually become very good at serving ourselves, which is really the essence of what sin is. And another important truth about Christianity is the focus on the person of Jesus. Jesus is God in the flesh, God incarnate. He is fully God and fully human, the only person to have ever done this, to be fully God and fully human. And also, He is the Messiah that was promised by God in the scriptures. In fact, God made this promise. He started this promise in Genesis chapter 3, soon after humanity had sinned against Him. Right away, God set the world up for redemption by saying that salvation would come. And how this salvation came, it came in the person of Jesus Christ, not only in His teaching, not only in what He did to help, to heal, to change lives, but most importantly, His death on the cross to pay the penalty for the sin of humanity. And then the incredible event of Christ dying on the cross and His final words there, that it is finished. It is finished. That is, the penalty is over. And now people can come to God sin-free because of the death of Jesus Christ. But not only did Jesus die, He was also resurrected from the dead. And He describes Himself as being the first fruits of those who will be resurrected. That is, everybody who is in Christ will be resurrected. We will have new bodies. We will be in a position where we can be like Christ was after His resurrection. Lives and bodies that will live on forever. I have no idea what that's going to be like when we're with God. All I know is it's going to be awesome, absolutely awesome. In fact, Peter talks about that eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor entered into any mind of what God has prepared for those who love Him. And that's an important statement, because following God, we don't do it out of duty. We are not submitting to Him out of fear, but rather we do it out of love. We are called to love God with our whole heart, mind, and soul, and our neighbors as ourselves. And then finally, Jesus will return to the earth at the end of this age. There will be an end of all this is happening on earth. And we long for those days. In fact, there's that word, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus. But until then, we must be faithful in our generation. We must be serving to the people around us through our church and through the people that we get to meet. God has us here for a reason, to represent Him well, so that people might know the wonderful grace that comes only through Jesus Christ. And the beautiful truth is this, that anyone who believes in Jesus and accepts his payment for their sin becomes a child of God and will be resurrected to eternal life with God. When I first heard this message, I was very karmic. I wasn't really interested in God, but I thought if there was a God, I just needed to keep doing good things. You know how that works. And that one day the balance will be, if there is a God, that I'd go up and see God, look, I've done all these good things, and so you should, whatever you're going to provide for me, let me come into heaven. And when I heard about the death of Jesus and what that means, I was so overwhelmed. I just couldn't believe it. And then I began to realize the life-changing reality of not only accepting that payment that Jesus had made for us, but then being indwelt with God's Spirit. And I will say that happened, I won't tell you when, but a lot of years ago, and I haven't gotten over it yet. And many of you listening to me right now, same thing with you. You just know how loved you are by God, and you are motivated to serve and to love him. The love that God gives to you and the grace that God gives to you is what empowers us to want to love those around us with the love of Jesus Christ. Because the next point is that good deeds cannot save you. You cannot never do enough good things. Good works are the result of salvation. In fact, Paul's going to say in just a moment here that this is how good works fit in. They don't save you. They're the result of that. And then finally, and most I think beautifully, is that every believer enters into a personal relationship with God. Awesome. In the Old Testament, in order for you to get to God, you had to be a priest, and you had to be a special priest, But now we come boldly to the throne of grace because of God's love. This passage that the Apostle Paul gives us in Ephesians says it best. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, and not a result of works, so that nobody can boast. For we are his workmanship. That word workmanship literally means work of art. We are God's work of art, created in Christ Jesus. Here's the word for good works. That is, the good works we do are not in order to be saved, but because we are. And God prepared beforehand that we should walk in these works. God prepared beforehand that he wanted to use us as his messengers to a world that desperately needs hope and salvation through Christ. So let's go back to our charts, if you remember from our last time. Naturalism, transcendentalism, and theism. And the four major questions, what we call ultimate questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. How do they answer them? Naturalism, remember, says creation, no creation. Things, however the universe came into existence, it was by natural means. Meaning in life, there isn't one. You can come up with one, you can find a reason to live, but there is no overall meaning to life. Morality, well, we determine it. It's up to us. And our destiny is annihilation. We're gone. Transcendentalism, of course, most of the Eastern religions would say that we are derived from one as human beings, whatever the one is, Brahma, whatever we want to call it. And the meaning in life is to recognize that everything is one, whether it be the stars, whether it be the planets, whether it be the sun, whether it be the nature, we are all part of that. And therefore, morality is determined how much you take care of that unity and harmony in the world around us. And then destiny is rebirth, the samsara, the wheel, where you keep going back and back until you break out of that cycle. And then the perspective of theism is that origin created by God, determined by God, or our meaning, morality, determined by God, and destiny, either eternity with or apart from God. These are the basic beliefs of not only Christianity, but of Judaism and Islam as well. So how does the Christian worldview compare? What are distinct about it over the things that we've just talked about? Here's how we will look at it. When we look at Christianity as opposed to Judaism and Islam, The major difference, of course, is the person of Jesus Christ. The person of Jesus Christ. And that is so, so important. In other words, we are not following a book. We are not following a religion. We are not following a philosophy. We are following a person, a follower of Jesus. In fact, the word Christian means associated to Christ. And so that's what we are. In fact, so many people today are not saying, they're not saying I'm a Christian. They're saying I'm a follower of Christ, which I really like, or I am Christ-centered. In fact, I will tell some Christian school teachers, I will say, well, you know, there's no such thing as a Christian school because schools can't be Christian, only people can. So once you say you're a Christ-centered school, and they say, oh, I like that. I mean, that's true, because for all of our lives, we're not trying to be good, following rules. We are trying to be good because God is good. And he's been good to us, and he wants us to be good to others and love others as he has loved us. So let's look at how Christianity then can compare. I like the idea of Christus Nexus, Christ at the center. That's a Latin word, Christus Nexus. And this wonderful quote from theologian John Stott said, Christianity is Christ. You take Christ from Christianity and you disembowel it. There's practically nothing left. Christ is the center of Christianity, and everything else is circumference. So that's a good way to think about your relationship to Christ and to others as well. Well, let's go back to our chart and see how the Christian worldview compares to the other worldviews. Following Christ, I have at the bottom there. Origin, well, of course, created by God. We believe that everything is created by God and that we were created in his image and likeness. What's the meaning of life? Scripture clearly tells us, the person of Jesus Christ clearly tells us that we are to glorify and to love God and to love others. The great command is that. Morality, who decides what's right and wrong? Well, it's really determined by the character and will of God. We're designed to follow God. We're designed to love God. And the things that we decide to do are the best things because we've seen them in the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ. And our destiny, well, it's determined by our relationship with Christ. No karma, no good works. It's not who you know. It's not what you've done. It's what he's done. And our destiny is determined by that relationship. And God desires all to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. And that's where we come in. Let me close with a brief story. I was invited to speak at a medical school. And it was a fascinating group to speak to because there were going to be some United States American Christians who were going to come together, and they were part of the Christian Medical Students Association, and they were studying there at the medical school. But the other group would be the Islamic Medical Students Association. So we would have about 50 or so Christian medical students and about 50 or so Islamic medical students. And the idea was that I was invited to go up to this city and to speak for about half an hour on what is Christianity. And then they had an Islamic scholar who was going to speak about what is Islam. And so I wanted to make sure I made the most of my time. So I talked to some of my friends who have ministries to Muslims. And he told me to focus on several things. One of them was grace, because as you know, as I just said earlier, every religion and worldview is karma, except for Christianity. And to focus on that undeserved favor that we have from God and his love. And they also said, focus on Jesus revealing God to us as Father. That's unique as well, because in the Old Testament, God is called Father only about a dozen times, and usually it's the Father of Israel. But in the New Testament, God is called Father about 250 times, over 100 of those by Jesus himself. And so we got there, and I spoke, and I talked about Christianity, some of its history, and so on. And I talked about grace, and I talked about how Jesus had revealed God as Father, so we can come to Him as Father, and He loves us as children, and what Jesus Christ had done to purchase our salvation, so that we might know our Father. Well, the Islamic scholar got up, and he was not very happy with what I had said. And he said to me, oh, he said to everybody there, he said, there are 99 names for Allah in the Quran. And then he looked down at me and said, and not one of them is Father. And then he said, we cannot call Allah Father because that brings him down to the human level. And then he looked at me again and said, and that is blasphemy. But then he went on, and I'm sitting there thinking, well, I just committed blasphemy, and but after it was all said and done, we had some Q&A with the students. It was really good. And so when we were dismissing, I went over to where the Muslim students were, and they were all talking among themselves. And I walked up and I said, excuse me. I said, so what do you think? And they got really quiet. And then one of the girls spoke up, and she said, it's Christianity. We have never understood it. It's awesome. And it is. For you and for me, when we talk about worldviews and so on, it's fascinating, isn't it? But the reality of the person of Jesus Christ, the salvation that comes through God's love and care and desire for us, is absolutely awesome. And so as we study worldviews, as we think out loud of trying to understand the world around us, not just so that we can be smarter, but so that we can be smarter in how we represent Jesus Christ to our world today. And that's why we're doing this series. And I hope that you're encouraged. I hope that you feel that you've gotten a handle on some things that will give you confidence to want to serve Him in incredible ways as God opens up doors, and you can share a message that is awesome. Well, God bless you. Thanks for being with us, and I look forward to joining you for session number 4.